The porch light flickered against the peeling paint of the Joliet duplex, a quiet testament to David's long, exhausting shifts at the warehouse. He had clocked out 3 hours early, carrying a wilted bouquet of gas station roses, only to freeze when he noticed a sleek, unfamiliar Audi parked in his driveway. The shadows moving behind their thin living room curtains weren't just a betrayal, they were the quiet shattering of a 10-year illusion. If you find yourself drawn to the fragile, dangerous edges of broken trust, stay with me. There are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered in the dark, so please, don't leave just yet. The rhythmic thumping of the highway dividers usually lulled David Wright into a state of numb exhaustion, but tonight, the cold Joliet air biting through the cracked window of his Ford F-150 kept him strangely alert. A blown transformer at the Regional Logistics Center had halted the conveyor lines, sending the entire night shift home 3 hours early. For a warehouse supervisor accustomed to the relentless, grinding hum of heavy machinery and the lingering smell of industrial cardboard, the sudden silence of a Tuesday at 2 a.m. felt almost alien. On the passenger seat lay a plastic-wrapped bouquet of pale pink carnations, picked up from a 24-hour Shell station. They were an apology. David had worked 60 hours the previous week, missing their anniversary dinner to cover a shift for a sick forklift operator. Summer had smiled. That tight, perfectly glossed smile she wore behind the cosmetics counter at Macy's, and told him it was fine. But David knew it wasn't. He knew the toll his calloused hands and steel-toed boots took on her suburban fantasies. He turned onto Elm Street, the headlights sweeping across rows of modest, aging duplexes. The neighborhood was asleep, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium street lamps. As David pulled up to his driveway, his foot hovered over the brake pedal. Parked in front of their detached garage was a sleek, midnight blue Audi A6. It didn't belong to the neighbors. It didn't belong in this zip code. David cut the engine. The sudden absence of the truck's rumble made the night feel oppressively heavy. He stepped out, the frost crunching softly beneath his boots, and walked toward the front porch. The glow of the television flickered through the thin, inexpensive sheer curtains Summer had insisted on buying to make the living room feel airy. He paused on the top step, his hand reaching for the doorknob, when a shadow moved across the pale light of the window. It wasn't one shadow. It was two, tangled together against the backdrop of the muted TV screen. David didn't breathe. The cold air burned his lungs as he stood paralyzed, the carnations gripped so tightly in his left hand that the plastic wrapper crinkled like static. Through the slight gap in the curtains, he saw her. Summer's unmistakable cascade of blonde hair, usually pinned up immaculately for work, was loose and disheveled. She was leaning against the edge of their discount store sofa, her head thrown back, laughing silently at something whispered by a man in a crisp, unbuttoned dress shirt. He recognized the profile instantly. Troy Knight, the regional sales director who frequently visited Summer's department store branch. The man whose name Summer dropped with casual admiration during dinners, praising his vision and ambition, words she rarely used when describing her husband's logistics schedules. A hot, suffocating wave of adrenaline rushed to David's ears, demanding action. The front door was unlocked. He could kick it open. He could unleash 10 years of exhaustion, of missed holidays, of backbreaking double shifts onto the polished hardwood floor. He could scream until his throat bled. But as he watched Troy's hand drift down the curve of his wife's waist, the rage suddenly crystallized into something entirely different: ice. A violent confrontation would give Summer the one thing she thrived on: drama. It would allow her to play the victim of a blue-collar husband's temper. It would give her a reason to justify her betrayal, a narrative she could sell to her friends over expensive lattes she couldn't afford. David looked down at the crushed carnations in his hand. He carefully set them on the freezing concrete of the porch, right beside the welcome mat. He didn't make a sound as he turned around, walked back to his truck, and quietly eased the door shut. He didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he sat in the dark, watching the Audi, watching his house, and feeling the last remnants of his marriage evaporate into the biting Illinois night. By the time he finally turned the key and drove away into the shadows, David Wright had already begun to dismantle her world. The neon sign of Hank's 24/7 Diner buzzed with a defective, erratic rhythm, casting a harsh crimson glow across the frost-laced windshield of David's truck. He hadn't gone inside. For the past 2 hours, he had remained in the driver's seat, the engine idling just enough to keep the heater pushing lukewarm air into the cab. The desolate parking lot was a concrete island, bordered by the dark, skeletal trees of the Illinois winter. David stared at his hands resting on the steering wheel. They were rough, the knuckles perpetually scraped, dirt permanently etched into the micro-fissures of his skin despite rigorous scrubbing. These were the hands that had loaded thousands of freight pallets, signed for endless overtime shifts, and meticulously balanced a checking account that always seemed to hemorrhage money. He turned his palms upward in the dim light. They felt entirely useless now. The image of the living room window replayed in his mind, not as a continuous film, but as a series of sharp, jagged photographs. Summer's head thrown back, the pristine fabric of Troy Knight's expensive shirt, the careless, intimate drape of a hand over her waist. Every time the slideshow looped, a phantom ache bloomed in David's chest, tight and suffocating, threatening to drag him back to Elm Street to kick his own front door off its hinges. He reached into his heavy canvas jacket and pulled out his phone. The screen illuminated the dark cab, showing a notification from their joint credit card app, a charge of $85 at a premium wine boutique in downtown Chicago, time-stamped at 3 that afternoon, a Tuesday. While David had been arguing with dispatchers over a delayed freight line, his wife had been buying wine for her lover with money from an account David bled for. A bitter, hollow laugh scraped its way up his throat. He had spent 10 years building a fortress of stability for a woman who despised the bricks he used. Summer didn't want the aging Joliet duplex, the warehouse paycheck, or the exhausted man who provided them. She wanted the gleaming Audi. She wanted the corporate prestige. She wanted a life where she didn't have to explain her husband's steel-toed boots to her perfectly manicured colleagues at the department store. David's thumb hovered over Summer's contact name. My Summer, it read, accompanied by a picture of her smiling brightly on a beach trip they had taken 3 years ago, a trip that took him 18 months to save for. He could call her right now. He could listen to the panic fracture her voice as the phone rang, echoing through the house while Troy was still lingering in their living room. He could detonate the bomb. But the thought of her excuses paralyzed his thumb. He knew exactly how the script would play out. The tears, the desperate apologies, the subtle, insidious shifting of blame. You're never here, David. I was so lonely. It meant nothing. She would weaponize his grueling work schedule, turning his sacrifices into the very justification for her betrayal. She would rewrite the history of their marriage to make herself the tragic heroine. David slowly locked the phone, plunging the cab back into the crimson shadows. The chaotic inferno in his chest began to cool, hardening into something dense, cold, and heavy. Anger was loud, it was messy, and left room for negotiation. What he felt now was a terrifying clarity. He didn't just want to yell. He wanted to dismantle the reality she had so carefully constructed. He wanted to systematically strip away the safety net he had provided, and let her fall directly into the life she thought she deserved. He shifted the truck into gear, the transmission groaning in protest against the freezing temperature. Tomorrow morning, he would walk into his house, kiss his wife's cheek, and ask her how her quiet evening was. He would become the perfect, oblivious husband. The silence would be his weapon, and looking at his calloused hands, David knew he had the endurance to wait her out. The deadbolt clicked with a heavy, metallic thud at exactly 7:15 a.m. The midnight blue Audi was long gone, leaving only a faint patch of melted frost on the asphalt of the driveway. David pushed the front door open, his steel-toed boots scuffing against the cheap linoleum of the entryway. He had spent the remaining hours of the night parked by the industrial canal, watching the dark water churn, waiting for the sun to rise and for Troy Knight to vacate his home. The duplex smelled of French vanilla from the plug-in diffuser Summer loved, but beneath the artificial sweetness, David's senses picked up a faint, sharp note of cedarwood and bergamot. It was a high-end cologne, something that didn't belong in a house, where the primary scents were usually laundry detergent and exhaustion. David? Summer's voice drifted from the kitchen, light and melodic. He found her standing by the faux granite island, sipping from a ceramic mug. She was already armored for the day. Her blonde hair was pinned back in a flawless, sleek twist. Her makeup was an immaculate mask of primer, foundation, and expertly blended contour. She wore a tailored black blouse, the standard uniform for the Macy's beauty counter, looking every inch the sophisticated woman she desperately wanted to be. "Hey," David said, his voice coming out remarkably steady. He walked over to the coffee maker, grabbing a mug. "Sorry I'm late. Dispatch had a meltdown over a missing freight manifest. Kept us there trying to trace it. It was an easy lie, a familiar blue-collar grievance. Summer didn't even look up from her phone screen. Her thumb swiped rhythmically through a social media feed. "That sounds awful, babe," she murmured, her tone perfectly sympathetic but entirely vacant. "You must be exhausted." "I am," David replied. He poured the lukewarm bitter coffee, keeping his back to her for a moment to compose his features. He turned around, leaning against the counter. "How was your night? Did you end up doing anything?" Summer finally looked up, offering a soft, practiced smile. Her eyes, framed by precise strokes of eyeliner, met his without a single flicker of hesitation. "Oh, it was so quiet. I just made some pasta, watched a few episodes of that real estate show, and went to bed early. I missed you, though. The house feels too big when you're on the night shift." The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. David stared at her, feeling a cold fascination wash over him. She was magnificent at it. There was no tell, no nervous shifting of weight, no avoiding his gaze. The lie was delivered, with the effortless grace of someone discussing the weather. For a terrifying second, David wondered if he had hallucinated the shadows in the living room, if he had imagined the Audi in the driveway. But then his eyes drifted to the sink. The dish rack was empty, save for 2 crystal wine glasses, the ones they had received as a wedding gift and supposedly never used because they were too nice for a Tuesday. They were washed, but the water spots on the rims betrayed their recent use. "I missed you too," David said quietly. He took a sip of the terrible coffee, swallowing the acid. Summer checked the delicate silver watch on her wrist and sighed dramatically. "I have to run. Troy is doing a regional walkthrough today, and he expects the counters to be flawless. You know how he gets about presentation." Hearing the name in her mouth, spoken with casual professional exasperation, felt like a physical blow to David's ribs. He forced a nod. "Have a good day at work. Knock 'em dead." Summer walked over and pressed her lips to his cheek. The kiss was dry, brief, and cold. She smelled of expensive setting spray and deceit. "Get some sleep, David," she said, grabbing her designer handbag from the chair. The front door clicked shut behind her. David stood in the center of the kitchen, the silence of the duplex rushing back in to suffocate him. He reached out, picked up one of the crystal wine glasses from the drying rack, and held it up to the morning light, examining the fingerprints left behind. The facade was perfect, but now he knew exactly where to strike to shatter it. The rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the Joliet Distribution Center usually grounded David. The aggressive beep of reversing forklifts, the heavy thud of wooden pallets hitting the concrete floor, the lingering smell of diesel exhaust and damp cardboard, it was a world that made sense. You put in the hours, you moved the freight, and you got paid. But today, standing in the cramped, fluorescent-lit supervisor's office, the noise felt entirely distant. Stephen Chen, a logistics coordinator who had navigated the warehouse floors with David for 6 years, leaned against the scarred metal desk. Stephen was a pragmatist, a man who viewed life strictly through the lens of supply chains, bottlenecks, and efficiency. He took a slow sip from a styrofoam cup of break-room coffee, his dark eyes studying David over the rim. "You look like hell, right?" Stephen noted, his voice flat, stripped of unnecessary sympathy. "Worse than the time we pulled 4 back-to-back doubles during the Black Friday rush." David stared at the dual monitors on his desk. Instead of freight routing schedules, the screens displayed the harsh, numeric reality of his 10-year marriage. "The holiday rush had an end date, Steve. This," he gestured vaguely to the glowing screens, "this is just a hemorrhage." David had spent his brief 30-minute lunch break logging into every financial account attached to his name. He knew Summer liked nice things, the tailored Macy's blouses, the imported skin creams, but he had always believed they were managing. He had believed his relentless overtime was keeping the water below the deck. He was wrong. Stephen stepped closer, his eyes scanning the open browser tabs. There were 3 separate credit cards David had never seen before, all maxed out, thousands of dollars spent on designer shoes, luxury weekend spa retreats in the city, and high-end dining. Purchases that perfectly coincided with the nights David was freezing on the loading dock, managing broken conveyor belts, so Troy Knight could unbutton his wife's shirt. She's building a whole different life on your credit score, Stephen observed quietly. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask who the other guy was or how David had found out. In the warehouse, you dealt with the mess in front of you. If you don't cut the line now, she's going to drag you down to the bottom with her. I can't just close them, David said, his voice dropping to a low, tight rasp. If I shut off the cards, she'll know I know. She'll panic. She'll start playing the victim, dragging the lawyers in early, twisting the narrative for her friends. Stephen pulled a worn notepad from the pocket of his high-vis vest. So we don't cut the line. We reroute the freight. He grabbed a pen and began sketching a crude diagram on a piece of scrap paper. First, you open a new account at a different bank, a local credit union, nowhere near your joint one. You divert your direct deposits starting next pay cycle. Then, you pull exactly half of whatever liquid cash is in the joint savings. Legally, it's yours. It won't trigger a fraud alert if it's an internal transfer. David watched the ink bleed into the cheap paper. The process was cold, mathematical. It was exactly what he needed to keep the anger from consuming him. What about the hidden debt? David asked, the phantom ache in his chest, momentarily overshadowed by the sheer logistical weight of survival. You freeze your credit, Stephen said, his tone entirely businesslike. Lock it down with all 3 bureaus tonight. She can keep making the minimum payments on the secret cards with whatever she makes at the beauty counter, but she won't be able to open a single new line of credit in your name to cover her tracks. You build a firewall. David looked back at the screen. A transaction from yesterday glared back at him. $85 at a wine boutique. Troy's Wine. Paid for by hours David had spent breathing in warehouse dust. Do it, David said, the hesitation burning away, leaving only the icy resolve he had found in the diner parking lot. Stephen nodded, tossing the pen onto the desk. I know a guy in HR. I can get your direct deposit switched quietly by the end of the shift. No red flags. As Stephen walked back out onto the noisy warehouse floor, David closed the browser tabs one by one. He was no longer just the exhausted, oblivious husband. He was the architect of his own departure. And as he locked his credit file with a final, decisive click of the mouse, he knew Summer's carefully constructed world of illusions had just run out of funding. At 3 a.m., the Joliet duplex was completely silent, save for the low, asthmatic hum of the refrigerator and the faint, rhythmic breathing drifting down the hallway from the master bedroom. Summer was asleep, wrapped in the Egyptian cotton sheets she had charged to a card David had already frozen. Sitting at the scarred wooden kitchen table, bathed in the harsh blue glare of a 5-year-old Dell laptop, David Wright was wide awake. A man who casually sleeps with his married subordinates on a Tuesday afternoon, David reasoned, does not do it just once. It wasn't an anomaly of passion, it was a symptom of power, and power always leaves a paper trail. David adjusted the screen's brightness, his tired eyes scanning through the labyrinth of corporate networking sites. He had spent the last 3 hours tracing Troy Knight's professional history. The progression was impressive on the surface. District manager in St. Louis, regional coordinator in Indianapolis, and now regional sales director covering the greater Chicago area. But looking closely at the timelines, a distinct, jagged pattern emerged. Troy never stayed in one district for more than 2 years. Switching tabs to an anonymous browser routed through a newly installed VPN, David dug into obscure retail employee forums and archived Glassdoor reviews for the specific department store branches Troy had managed. It took time, but the warehouse had taught David patience. You move the boxes one by one until you find what's buried at the bottom of the pallet. He found the first anomaly in a thread from 3 years ago regarding the Indianapolis branch. An anonymous user, posting under a generic handle, warned new hires in the cosmetics department to avoid private performance reviews with a TK. 6 months later, 3 female employees abruptly resigned within a 2-week window. There were no lawsuits filed, no public scandals, just sudden, quiet exits, followed shortly by Troy's promotion and transfer to Chicago. Corporate had swept it under the rug. They had moved the liability. David opened a secure, encrypted email service that didn't require a phone number for verification. He sat perfectly still for a moment, listening to the quiet rustle of blankets from the bedroom. Summer thought Troy was her ticket out of the working-class grind, a sophisticated escape from her mundane reality. She didn't realize she was merely the latest acquisition in a predator's portfolio. His fingers began to move across the keyboard, the clicking deliberately soft. He didn't write with the fiery indignation of a betrayed husband. He wrote with the cold, sterile precision of an auditor. Subject: Inquiry regarding Regional Director Troy Knight, pattern of subordinate misconduct. He addressed it directly to the Vice President of Human Resources at the retail chain's corporate headquarters in New York. He laid out the timeline. He listed the store locations, the dates of Troy's transfers, and the corresponding spikes in sudden turnover among young female staff. He provided the archived links to the employee forums. He did not mention Summer's name. Summer was irrelevant to corporate HR. She was just another potential liability waiting to detonate. Given the current climate regarding workplace power dynamics and executive liability, David typed, his face illuminated like a ghost in the dark kitchen, it would be prudent for the Ethics Committee to audit Mr. Knight's travel expenses and hotel bookings over the past 6 months. Specifically, cross-referencing unauthorized midday visits to the Joliet branch. He read the message twice. It was entirely dispassionate. It was a perfectly designed spark placed at the edge of a very dry forest. David moved the cursor over the send button. Down the hall, Summer shifted in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible into the dark. David didn't blink. He clicked the mouse. The screen flashed briefly as the encrypted message vanished into the digital ether, bound for New York. He closed the laptop, plunging the kitchen into absolute, suffocating darkness. The first domino had just been tipped. The erasure of David Wright did not happen in a single, dramatic weekend. It happened in increments of cotton, denim, and paper, executed with the precision of a man who managed warehouse inventory for a living. It began in the master bathroom. One Tuesday morning, while Summer was in the shower, David removed his electric razor, his spare toothbrush, and a bottle of aftershave from the vanity cabinet. He placed them in a duffel bag he had stashed in the trunk of his Ford. When Summer stepped out, wrapped in a plush towel and enveloped in a cloud of eucalyptus steam, she complained about the humidity ruining her blowout. She did not notice the extra 3 inches of empty space on the second shelf. By week 2, David moved to the closet. The strategy was mathematical. For every 3 dress shirts Summer pushed aside to reach her tailored Macy's blouses, David removed one of his heavy flannel work shirts. He took the winter coats first, reasoning that he was keeping them in the truck for early morning shifts. He packed away his heavy boots, leaving only the pair he wore daily and an old pair of sneakers. He slid the empty wooden hangers to the far back corners of the closet, spacing the remaining garments slightly wider so the visual density remained unchanged. He was dissecting their shared life like a surgeon removing a tumor, careful not to sever the main arteries before the patient was fully anesthetized. The true measure of Summer's disconnect became terrifyingly clear on a Thursday evening. David was in the garage, quietly packing a small cardboard box with his socket wrenches, a vintage compass his grandfather had given him, and a stack of important documents, his passport, birth certificate, and the newly printed statements from his solitary credit union account. The door leading to the kitchen opened. Summer leaned against the frame, holding a glass of Pinot Noir, bought with her own diminished funds now that his credit was locked. She was wearing a silk robe, her phone clutched in her other hand. "David, the Wi-Fi is dragging again," she sighed, entirely ignoring the open box at his feet. "I was right in the middle of a video call with the regional team. Troy was going over the new quarterly targets, and it just froze." David slowly closed the flaps of the cardboard box, his heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. A month ago, the mention of Troy's name would have spiked his adrenaline. Now, it was just a data point. "I'll reset the router in a minute," David said, sliding the box casually behind the lawnmower. "Were they important targets?" "Crucial," Summer replied, taking a delicate sip of her wine. Her eyes were glazed, fixed on some distant, glamorous horizon that didn't include the oil stains on the garage floor. "Troy says the Chicago market is volatile right now. He needs everyone completely focused." "Well," David murmured, turning his back to her to wipe his hands on a shop rag. "I'm sure he appreciates your dedication." "He does," she smiled, a genuine, soft expression that she hadn't directed at David in years. It was a smile meant for the man on the frozen screen. She turned and walked back into the kitchen, the door clicking shut behind her. David stood in the damp cold of the garage, surrounded by the hollowed-out shell of his marriage. Over 21 days, he had removed 50% of his wardrobe, all of his personal tools, his financial history, and his family heirlooms. He had stripped his existence down to a toothbrush, a work uniform, and the fragile illusion of his presence. He looked at the empty space on the workbench, where his toolkit used to sit. Summer lived in a world constructed entirely of surfaces, and as long as the surface of her husband appeared intact, she never bothered to look beneath it. She was so captivated by the reflection of the life she wanted, she didn't realize the man standing next to her had already faded to a ghost. The Joliet duplex smelled of roasted rosemary, expensive butter, and desperation. Summer had spent the entire afternoon transforming their modest dining room into a facsimile of a Gold Coast bistro, laying out the linen napkins and the crystal wine glasses. David now knew she had already broken in. She had invited 3 of her colleagues from the cosmetics floor, but the entire evening was meticulously orchestrated around the presence of one guest, Troy Knight. When the doorbell rang at 7, David was the one who opened it. He wore a clean, simple button-down, his calloused hands resting easily at his sides. Troy stepped over the threshold, bringing with him a gust of freezing wind and the sharp scent of cedarwood and bergamot. Up close, the regional director was exactly the kind of man corporate retail loved to promote. He had a perfectly faded haircut, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and a silver Rolex that caught the entryway light. "David, good to finally meet you," Troy said, extending a smooth, manicured hand. "Summer talks about you all the time." "Troy," David replied, his grip firm, his expression entirely unreadable. "Welcome to our home. She's mentioned you too, mostly your vision for the district." Summer materialized from the kitchen, her cheeks flushed, wearing a silk slip dress that David had never seen before. Her eyes darted nervously between the two men, a microscopic tension tightening her jaw. She was terrified of the collision of her two realities, the gritty, exhausted husband she settled for, and the polished, affluent lover she desperately wanted. "Let me take your coat, Troy," Summer offered, her voice slightly higher than its usual register. The dinner proceeded with agonizing civility. David sat at the head of the small table, quietly carving the roast and refilling glasses. He watched the subtle geometry of the betrayal unfold in real time. He caught the lingering eye contact between Summer and Troy across the centerpiece. He noticed how Troy subtly shifted his knee under the table, closing the physical distance between himself and Summer's chair. The 3 young women from the beauty counter carried the conversation, complaining about difficult customers and inventory shortages. Troy played the benevolent leader, offering corporate platitudes and sipping the $85 Pinot Noir that Summer had poured. "It's a tough market right now," Troy declared, swirling the dark liquid in his crystal glass. He looked directly at David, a patronizing tilt to his head. "But it's all about logistics, right, David? Getting the right product to the right place. You must understand that from the warehouse." "Absolutely," David said mildly. He leaned back in his chair, picking up his own glass of water. "It's all about tracking the supply chain. You have to know where the liabilities are. If a piece of machinery is defective, it doesn't matter how good it looks on the floor. Eventually, it breaks down and costs the company. You have to cut it loose before it brings the whole line to a halt." A brief, confused silence fell over the table. Troy's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to decipher if the warehouse supervisor had just insulted him. Summer let out a high, brittle laugh, desperate to diffuse a tension she couldn't fully comprehend. "David is always talking in warehouse metaphors," she interjected smoothly, reaching out to pour Troy another measure of wine. "It's practically a different language." "Well, it's effective," Troy murmured, his gaze still fixed on David. "I find it keeps things clear," David replied, offering a polite, empty smile. For the rest of the evening, David moved through the motions with flawless precision. He cleared the plates, he brewed the decaf coffee, and he walked their guests to the door. When Troy finally left, slipping into his midnight blue Audi, David stood on the porch and watched the taillights fade down Elm Street. Inside, Summer was humming as she loaded the dishwasher, high on the success of her performance. She had no idea that the man washing the crystal glasses beside her was merely a hologram, and that the corporate guillotine hanging over her lover's neck was already descending. The text message arrived at 9:15 a.m. on Saturday. "Boarding the train to the Chicago seminar now. Will call you tonight. Love you." David stared at the glowing screen of his phone, watching the small gray bubble vanish into the digital archive of their marriage. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. By now, Troy Knight's Audi was likely cruising up Interstate 55, carrying Summer toward a luxury hotel paid for by a corporate expense account. An account that was currently the subject of an intensive, high-priority internal audit in New York. David locked his phone and slid it into the pocket of his faded jeans. The duplex was profoundly quiet. It was the kind of silence that usually preceded a violent storm, heavy and thick with unsaid things. He walked into the master bedroom and pulled a single black duffel bag from the top shelf of his closet. Over the past 3 weeks, he had already dismantled the architecture of his life here. What remained was merely the scaffolding. He took his last 3 work shirts off their hangers, folding them meticulously. He emptied the top drawer of his nightstand, a phone charger, a spare set of truck keys, a worn leather wallet containing his new credit union cards. He moved to the bathroom. The removal of his final toothbrush and a half-empty tube of toothpaste took less than 30 seconds. He wiped down the porcelain sink with a hand towel, leaving the surface spotless. Summer hated water stains. As he zipped the duffel bag closed, David paused at the foot of the bed. The midday sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the cold, still air. 10 years of his life had been spent within these thin, poorly insulated walls. 10 years of double shifts, of bruised knuckles, of compromising his own exhaustion to fund a mirage of suburban stability. He waited for a surge of anger, or perhaps a wave of crippling sorrow, but the well was completely dry. There was only the sterile, hollow feeling of a warehouse after the final freight truck had departed. He carried the bag to the front door, setting it down on the cheap linoleum entryway. The final task required a different kind of precision. David walked into the kitchen, his boots silent on the floorboards. He opened the junk drawer and pulled out a plain, white notepad and a black ballpoint pen. He sat at the kitchen island, staring at the faux granite surface where Summer had stood weeks ago, effortlessly lying about her quiet evening at home while drinking Troy's wine. He didn't write a manifesto. He didn't list Troy's name, nor did he outline the crushing debt he had legally walled off, or the HR investigation that would soon detonate Troy's career. Explanations were for people who wanted to be understood. Arguments were for people who still cared enough to fight. David wanted neither. He pressed the pen to the paper and wrote a single, devastatingly simple sentence. He placed the note exactly in the center of the island. Then, he reached for his left hand. The gold band was scratched and dull, worn down by years of gripping steering wheels and heavy machinery. It slid off with a slight resistance, leaving a pale, indented circle of skin in its wake. He set the ring directly on top of the white paper, a heavy, metallic anchor for the weight of his silence. David picked up his duffel bag, stepped out onto the porch, and locked the front door behind him. He didn't look back at the duplex as he walked to his truck. He climbed into the cab, turned the ignition, and merged onto the street, dissolving into the gray Joliet afternoon like a ghost who had finally finished his haunting. The midnight blue Audi idled at the curb, its exhaust pluming in the crisp Sunday evening air. Summer leaned back through the passenger window, offering Troy a lingering, glossed smile. They had spent the weekend in a high-rise suite overlooking the Chicago River, drinking champagne on a corporate card and ignoring the gritty reality of the Joliet suburbs. "See you tomorrow at the regional call," Troy murmured, his eyes already drifting toward the dashboard screen as an incoming email pinged. "Drive safe," Summer replied, pulling her designer weekender bag over her shoulder. She walked up the concrete path to the duplex, fishing for her keys. She expected the familiar routine: David asleep before his night shift, the low hum of the television, the smell of cheap coffee lingering in the kitchen. But as she turned the deadbolt and pushed the door open, the air inside felt fundamentally different. It was stale. The plug-in diffuser had run dry, leaving only the faint, metallic scent of coal dust and empty space. "David?" she called out, dropping her bag by the entryway. Only the hum of the refrigerator answered her. She walked into the living room. The television was off. The cheap sheer curtains were drawn tight against the fading twilight. She moved toward the kitchen, intending to pour a glass of water, when she saw it. In the exact center of the faux granite island, illuminated by the pale light filtering through the window, sat a plain white notepad. Resting precisely on top of it was a dull gold wedding band. Summer froze. The silence of the house suddenly felt deafening, pressing against her eardrums like deep water. She took a slow step forward, her high heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. Her hand trembled as she reached out, pushing the heavy gold band aside to read the single sentence written in David's meticulous, blocky handwriting. "I saw you on Tuesday." There was no exclamation point, no frantic scribbles of rage, just a statement of fact, cold and absolute. A sharp, icy spike of adrenaline pierced her chest. Tuesday, the night he came home early, the night Troy was here. He had seen them, but he hadn't broken the door down. He hadn't screamed. He had made her coffee the next morning. He had sat at their dining table and served them dinner, looking Troy right in the eyes. Panic, raw and suffocating, clawed at her throat. Summer turned and ran down the short hallway to the master bedroom. She threw open the closet doors. At first glance, it looked normal. Her tailored blouses and silk dresses still hung in a pristine row. But as her eyes adjusted, she noticed the subtle gaps. The flannel shirts were gone. The heavy winter coats were missing. She rushed into the bathroom and tore open the vanity cabinet. The electric razor, the aftershave, the spare toothbrush, erased. She ran to the kitchen and threw open the garage door. The space where his Ford F-150 usually sat was empty, save for a few dark oil stains on the concrete. His workbench was completely bare. The vintage compass, the socket wrenches, the stacks of organized paperwork, all vanished. He hadn't left in a sudden fit of blind rage. He had packed his life away, slowly, deliberately, right in front of her, and she had been entirely too consumed by her own reflection to notice him fading away. Summer sank to her knees on the cold garage floor, the silk of her dress pooling around her. She clutched her phone, her thumb hovering frantically over David's contact. She pressed call. The automated voice of the carrier responded immediately. The number had been permanently disconnected. The realization hit her, not with the fiery drama she had always craved, but with the terrifying, paralyzing grip of total abandonment. She was sitting alone in a half-empty house, anchored only to a man who viewed her as a temporary corporate luxury. David had not just left her. He had surgically removed himself from her existence, leaving her bleeding out in the quiet, devastating silence. The fluorescent lights of the Macy's Cosmetics floor had always felt glamorous to Summer, a bright spotlight illuminating her curated life. But this Monday morning, they felt like the harsh, unforgiving glare of an interrogation room. She had barely slept. The image of the dull gold ring sitting on the blank notepad was burned into her retinas, a brand on her consciousness that throbbed with every heartbeat. She checked her phone for the 100th time. No new messages. Since her frantic, hyperventilating voicemails to Troy at 2 a.m., there had been absolute silence. She needed him. With David gone, and the crushing realization that her bank accounts were suddenly severed and drained of David's income, Troy was the only bridge left standing in the wreckage of her life. At 10:15 a.m., her phone buzzed in her uniform pocket. The caller ID flashed Troy's name. Summer ducked into the narrow, windowless stockroom behind the fragrance displays, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Troy, thank God," she breathed, her voice trembling. "David left. He knew." "He took everything and—" "Shut up," Troy hissed. The voice on the other end was unrecognizable. The smooth, patronizing regional director who had bought her champagne 36 hours ago was gone, replaced by the frantic tone of a cornered animal. "Do not say another word, Summer. Where are you right now?" "I'm at work, in the stockroom." "Troy, I'm scared. I don't have—" "Listen to me very carefully," Troy interrupted, his breathing erratic. "You and I are done. As of this exact second. You delete my number. You delete every text, every photo, every email. If anyone asks, I am your regional director and nothing more." Summer leaned against a tower of cardboard inventory boxes, the cold concrete of the floor seeping up through her sheer tights. "What are you talking about?" "Troy, I need you. My husband is gone. I have no money. He froze my—" "I don't care about your husband," Troy snapped, his volume rising before he caught himself. "Corporate HR was waiting for me when I walked into the Chicago office this morning. 2 auditors from New York. They have everything, Summer. My hotel receipts, my travel logs, anonymous forum posts from Indianapolis 3 years ago. Someone tipped them off. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over Summer. Someone. It's all about tracking the supply chain, David had said at their dining table, swirling water in his glass, while Troy drank the $85 wine she had bought. You have to know where the liabilities are. You have to cut it loose before it brings the whole line to a halt. The air in the stockroom thinned until she could barely draw a breath. David hadn't just packed his bags. He had dropped a lit match on Troy's career on his way out the door. "They're seizing my company laptop and phone at noon," Troy continued, his voice dripping with pure, selfish panic. "They're talking about a severance package if I sign an NDA and resign quietly. But if they find out about this weekend, they'll terminate with cause. No severance. I'll be blacklisted in retail management." "But what about me?" Summer whispered, the words tasting like ash in her dry mouth. "What am I supposed to do?" "You're going to keep your mouth shut," Troy said coldly. "You were just another associate I was reviewing. That's it. Do not contact me again, Summer. I mean it. You are on your own." The line went dead. Summer slowly lowered the phone. The stockroom was suffocating, smelling of damp cardboard and aggressively sweet perfume testers. She looked at her reflection in the small, smudged mirror hanging on the back of the supply closet door. The flawless makeup was starting to crack, the mascara flaking around her exhausted, terrified eyes. She had traded a man who spent 10 years breaking his back to build her a foundation, for a man who didn't hesitate to throw her under the rubble the second his own walls shook. She was entirely alone, standing in the dark, clutching a dead phone, finally understanding the true, crushing weight of David's silence. Finding him took 3 weeks of humiliating desperation. The eviction warning had already been taped to the front door of the Joliet duplex, a bright neon orange sticker that Summer couldn't hide from the neighbors. Her credit cards were declining at the grocery store, and without David's income, her Macy's paycheck didn't even cover the minimum payments on her secret debt. Troy was gone, swallowed up by a sudden, scandal-ridden corporate resignation. She had finally tracked David down by waiting in her car across the street from the logistics warehouse, following his Ford F-150 at a discreet distance at the end of his day shift. He had transferred from nights to days. It was a small detail, but it felt like a slap. He had only worked the grueling night shifts to afford the life she demanded. She stood outside Unit 4B of a modest, brick apartment complex. The neighborhood was quiet, lacking the manicured lawns of Elm Street, but it was remarkably clean. Summer's hand shook as she raised it to the cheap metal door. She was not wearing her flawless makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and the dark circles under her eyes were prominent. She needed him to yell. She needed him to call her names, to throw things, to give her something she could react to, something that proved he still cared enough to be furious. She knocked. 3 sharp, desperate raps. A moment later, the deadbolt turned. The door opened. David stood in the threshold, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and faded jeans. He looked rested. The perpetual, exhausted tension that used to tighten the corners of his eyes was entirely gone. He held a ceramic mug of black coffee, the steam curling into the cold hallway air. He didn't flinch when he saw her. His expression remained perfectly neutral, like a man finding a stranger at his door selling magazine subscriptions. "David," Summer choked out, the tears she had been holding back instantly spilling over. "Please." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "How did you find this address, Summer?" His voice was calm, conversational, stripped of any underlying venom. "I followed you from the warehouse," she admitted, her voice breaking. She reached out, her manicured fingers gripping the doorframe as if it were the edge of a cliff. "David, I have nothing. The house is going into foreclosure. The bank is calling every day. Troy is gone. He abandoned me. You destroyed him, and he left me with nothing." She waited for the flash of triumph in his eyes, the smug satisfaction of a revenge successfully executed, but there was nothing. Just the steady, unblinking gaze of a man looking at a broken machine. "You should forward your mail," David said mildly. "The divorce papers were finalized by my attorney yesterday. They'll be sent to the duplex. If you're being evicted, you need to update your address with the court." "Are you even listening to me?" Summer screamed, the sudden volume echoing down the concrete breezeway. The facade shattered entirely. "I ruined our marriage. I slept with another man in our living room. Aren't you going to scream at me? Aren't you going to call me a whore? Hit the wall, David. Do something," she sobbed, her chest heaving, waiting for the explosion. David looked at her trembling hands, then up to her tear-streaked face. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't the silence of suppressed rage. It was the deafening silence of an empty room. "Why would I scream at you, Summer?" he asked softly, a genuine, terrifying lack of emotion in his tone. "I don't care enough to be angry anymore. You were a liability on the floor, and I cut the line." He didn't wait for her to process the warehouse metaphor. He didn't wait for her to compose herself. He simply stepped back, his eyes passing over her one last time with absolute indifference. "Take care of yourself," he murmured. The door clicked shut, the deadbolt sliding into place with a heavy, metallic finality. Summer stood alone in the freezing hallway, her screams dying in her throat, finally understanding that the most violent thing David could have ever done to her was to simply stop caring. 6 months after the deadbolt clicked shut, the bitter Joliet winter finally surrendered to a damp, hesitant spring. In Unit 4B, David Wright woke up at 5:30 a.m. without the sharp screech of an alarm clock. The early morning light filtered through the inexpensive aluminum blinds, casting thin, gray shadows across a bedroom that held only the essentials: a bed, a dresser, and a small stack of paperback books. He stretched, the joints in his shoulders popping, but the chronic, suffocating weight that used to sit squarely on his chest was gone. He walked into his small kitchenette and started the coffee maker. It was a cheap brand, bought at a local hardware store, and the coffee he brewed was standard diner grade. As he leaned against the laminate counter, waiting for the pot to fill, he looked down at his left hand. The pale, indented circle on his ring finger had finally faded, blending back into the calloused, weathered skin. He had recently been promoted to a daytime logistics manager. Stephen Chen had taken him out for a beer to celebrate. His bank account was slowly growing, completely insulated from high-end boutiques and luxury hotel charges. When the coffee finished, David poured a mug, stepped out onto his tiny concrete balcony, and listened to the distant hum of the highway. He didn't think about the duplex on Elm Street. He didn't wonder about the Audi. He simply stood in the cool morning air, breathing in a silence that was no longer a weapon of revenge, but a profound, undisturbed peace. Across town, on a cracked sidewalk slick with morning drizzle, Summer Rae stood under the inadequate shelter of a plexiglass bus stop. The duplex had been repossessed by the bank in late February. Without David's income, her credit score had plummeted, leaving her unable to secure a lease on a decent apartment. She now rented a cramped, dark studio above a defunct laundromat on the city's crumbling outskirts. She had also lost her position at Macy's. As the corporate investigation into Troy Knight ripped through the district, her association with him had made her a quiet liability. She wasn't fired, but her shifts were systematically reduced until she had no choice but to resign. She was currently wearing the scratchy, polyester polo shirt of a discount pharmacy chain. The fabric irritated her skin. She had no umbrella, and the damp air was slowly ruining her hair, which she now tied back in a hurried, lifeless ponytail. The expensive skin creams had run out months ago, and without them, the exhaustion and unrelenting stress were permanently etched into the corners of her eyes. A car drove past, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt, splashing a fine mist of dirty water onto her sensible, cheap shoes. It was a dark blue sedan. For a fraction of a second, her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to the license plate, a phantom jolt of adrenaline spiking in her chest. But it was just a Honda. Troy Knight was gone, having quietly relocated to another state to salvage a lower-tier management job, leaving no forwarding address. Summer looked down at her phone. The screen was cracked in the top right corner. There were no messages. There were no missed calls. She pulled her thin jacket tighter against the chill, shivering as a gust of wind swept down the gray street. She had spent years despising the working-class grind, desperately chasing a mirage of wealth and status. Now, she was completely submerged in it, stripped of the one person who had tirelessly acted as her anchor. As the city bus finally groaned to a halt in front of her, opening its doors with a heavy sigh of pneumatic brakes, Summer stepped aboard into the deafening, absolute silence of the rest of her life.